Hello, my name is Lorna, and today we're going to be learning how to make a narwhal on the bead loom. So the first thing we need to do is set up our bead loom, and we're going to start by adding our warp threads. Our warp threads are the threads that are going to go lengthwise. So I'm just taking my looming thread here, and the thread that you use just needs to be really strong so that when you pull it, it doesn't break. And that when you pass it through the bead multiple times with the needle, it doesn't get stuck. So it needs to be able to pass at least 2, but hopefully 3 or 4 times. And you'll see why later on. So I just tied a simple square knot around this peg here, and this peg is what's going to hold all of our warp threads. You could cut lengths of your threads and wrap it around the slider bar, but I'm doing a very small design, so I don't need to do that. This is a very simple way for beginners to start a bead loom with the warp threads. Because I'm not going to be dealing with a lot of loose strands, I'm just working from one thread and pulling along. So the top of my bead loom has what looks like a little spring, and these springs are what are dividing the warp threads. So I'm going to place one string into every one of these, and I need 14 strings because I have 13 beads in my design. So you always have one more warp thread than you do beads. You do that so that you have one bead on the one warp thread on the inside of the bead and one warp thread on the outside of the bead, because we're going to be using those to hold the beads in. So if your design calls for 6 beads, you need 7 threads in this step. So I'm just continuing. I'm going through the spring, down, around, back up. And you're just going to continue doing this pattern. And I'm not pulling the thread from the spool. I'm holding tension in between my fingers as I'm doing this because I want all of the threads to have tension and be tight on the loom. If I have any loose or sagging threads at this point, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get them all with the same tension. So I'm working with a tight loom, tight threads, and I'm going to show you how to tighten it up even further after I've done this. And that should be the last thread. So I always make sure to count, and count again, because I do make mistakes when I'm doing the loom. And the last thing you want is to have too many strands or not enough strands after you've already tied it off. So it's important to count your strands of your warp threads to make sure that they match the pattern that you're choosing. Again, I am going for 14 of these threads. So I'm going to go ahead and count. And I have 2 too many. So that's the importance of counting your warp threads. I counted as I went, and I just miscounted. So it's very important to double check your work. You'll find out soon enough that when you go and put your beads in, whether you have too few or too many rows as well. Today I'm going to be using glass seed beads. These seed beads are going to be 12 O's. And they are not Miyuki beads or not delicas. And that just means that they are not perfectly cut. They are irregular beads. So I'm going to have a little bit of variation between my rows as far as consistency goes. I have some slightly smaller beads and slightly bigger beads, even though they are all in the 12/0 sizes. So I'm just tying off that other end back to the thread that I started with in a square knot. Alternatively, if you chose, say, 1.5 feet worth of string, you would just tie them all on in this way and place them all in individually. So on the side of these little bars, you'll see that there is a wing nut. And the wing nut can be turned righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So I'm going to loosen my wing nut up, and I'm just going to turn the barrel here so that the strings tighten up. I'm going to pull it towards me, and then I'm going to tighten this wing nut. The first one, you really just need to give it a quick little tighten and then move on to the other side. Make sure that your wing nut is completely tightened on the other side before you do the next step. So I'm just going to loosen my wing nut, and I'm going to pull towards me. And you're going to see that the tension on the strings, you should be able to push on it and it shouldn't go in. It should feel really tight. It shouldn't sag at all. And this is important because the strings, the warp threads, are going to be holding in your beads. And if they're loose, they're not going to be able to hold in your beads. So you'll see that after it's tightened, I have a slight bow in my loom, and that's what I want. I want it to be so tight that my loom is actually starting to bow a bit. And that's how you know you've gotten a good tight loom. It should be very tight and slightly bouncy. So quickly, I'm just going to show you how to make a grid so that you can make your own bead patterns. I just used a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch grid system, and I'm just using a ruler and some paper. It's not too difficult. I have my finished bead pattern here. I actually went with 13 rows instead of 12 rows, so it is 13 and not 12, and I have 14 threads. So the beads that I have here are listed below if you'd like to recreate this pattern. I just have some gold for the narwhal's horn. I have some black and some gray. It's more of like a dark gray and a light gray. And then I also have this blue sea glass blend that I'm going to be using. So I have here, again, these are 12/0 seed beads. And they're just random sizes, so they're 12/0s, but again, they're not consistent in their cut. So you're gonna see what that means as I work along my pattern is that sometimes there's going to be some space, and it's gonna be a little bit more difficult to get them into the bead loom. And you can change your colors. You could do red, you could do white. It really does not matter what colors you choose for your design. So I have here my looming thread, and I'm going to add it to a split needle. I like to use split needles, but really any needle, including a sewing needle, will work. You want to make sure that it can pass through the size bead that you're using at least 2 times and hopefully 3 times, so that when you're weaving your ends back in and you're passing through the beads, you don't get stuck. Again, I'm using irregular beads, so sometimes you'll see that I do get stuck. And I just take the needle off, which is why I like to use the split needles. If you're using a different kind of needle, it kind of falls off sometimes, and it's a little bit more difficult to put back on. Split needles are quick to work with, so that's why I like to use those. So I'm just going to put on my beads. I'm putting on 13 blue beads, and I'm going to try and hold these underneath my warp thread. So the beads are going on the weft thread, and they're going underneath the warp threads. So the beads are going underneath, and I'm popping those in. The first 3 rows are going to be quite difficult. And that's just because the springs are holding your warp threads apart at the top, and it gives less tension towards the middle. So after the first 3 rows, it tends to get a lot easier. So I'm just going to support my beads underneath with my index finger and push my needle through the top of my beads. So when you're using your weft thread, again, you're putting on your 13 beads and going under your loom. Then you're bringing your string around the loom and up to the top. So I'm going over top of those warp threads with my weft thread, or my working end. You can call it the working end. So you want to make sure you're making a circle essentially around your warp threads. So you're going under with the beads and over with the needle, under with the beads and over with the needle. And you're just going to repeat that process for the entirety of your project. So it might be easier just to see than my explanation is that I am taking my beads, putting them on, popping them through the warp thread. So every single warp thread holds a bead, and you want to make sure that you have a bead in every warp thread and not 2 beads in every warp thread, because sometimes with these irregular beads, 2 beads will try and sneak their way in there. And sometimes with these first 3 rows, it just takes dropping the beads and adjusting and pulling them back up to get them all in their right space. You could also go through just a few beads and kind of pop the other ones into place, go through 3 more, pop the other ones into place, go through 3 more, if it's too difficult to hold. The wider your pattern, the more difficult it is to hold these beads in place. When I am teaching my students when they're first starting out on the loom, we do no more than 3 beads, because you can hold those 3 beads with just the tip of your finger instead of the whole part of your finger, which is more difficult. So you see here, the struggle is real getting these beads popped up in here. And it just takes a little bit of time, making sure that your needle is going through every bead on top of your warp threads. If you do drop a bead, which means that your bead comes out or it's not captured in the warp threads because you accidentally go under the warp thread, it's okay. You can go back in and add beads back in. You can go and pick those beads back up by just taking your weft thread and weaving it back around through that row. You could also just pop your split needle off, take that row off, try again. So it's important to always double check your rows after you're done with each row so that you can fix your mistakes before you get too far along. If you were to miss a bead or drop a bead and then continue on 10 rows, it's going to be a lot more challenging, and you might have some warping in your project if you don't check that. So I have my beads in these little containers. It makes it a little bit easier for me to grab them because it's kind of like fishing. I just kind of stab in the dark and hope that I get some beads. You could alternatively use a felt mat or a beading mat so that you can pick up the beads off of the table. The way that my camera is set up, table work is quite difficult because I keep hitting the light. So these little containers are working best for my setup, and the camera is really close to this bead loom, so I don't have a lot of work area to do much in between. So I work with a really long thread, and that's why you see me pulling through so much. I tend to work with 1.5 yards of string. Most people are more comfortable with a little less than 1 yard, which is about 2.5 feet is what they're mostly comfortable with. I don't like to continuously add thread into my beadwork, and I know I'm using a smaller design today, and I know that I can get away with 3 yards of string for this design. But if you're more comfortable working with smaller amounts of thread and you don't want to make it your life's work to pull the thread through, you're welcome to. And I will show you how to weave in ends and add string later on. If I get stuck in a bead, sometimes I will take a pair of pliers and pull my needle through because my grip strength isn't the best. So I like to use the tools to help it along. You want to give it kind of a wiggle motion when you're using pliers to pull the needle through because you don't want to split a bead. If you break a bead, they are glass, the ones that I'm using anyways, and they could cut your warp threads, which then will ruin your project and you'll have to start over. You don't want to damage your piece. You could alternatively go back out through the bead and take that bead off and find one that fits better. So these are the last 3 rows here, and it's going to get significantly easier. So I'm just following my pattern along. Every bead is marked and I can just count the beads. So if I have 7 blue, 1 gold, and 2 blue, you could use a piece of paper to go over your pattern so you don't get lost. You could also check off your pattern, which you'll see me doing with pink marker later on, is I need to keep track of my pattern so that I don't double up on a row or skip a row, because then I'll have a distorted narwhal, and no one wants a distorted narwhal. So again, I'm going under, popping all these beads in here. And if you were using Miyuki beads or Delicas, what would happen is that your beads, when you pop them in there, they'll stay. They're not going to fall out like they're doing on me. It's those little pesky small beads that are just, they're falling out. They don't want to stay because the tension of the warp threads is not able to hold them in because they're too small for the hole. They're too loose. So that's okay though. We use what we have. These beads are significantly cheaper than the Miyuki beads. So I'm going to speed this part up, and you're going to see all the rows happen right before your eyes. This is about 30 minutes worth of work, sped up to about 1.5 minutes. So the process is all the same though. And you can see how much easier it has gotten. The beads are now just sticking right in there without a whole lot of fuss. So if you are a beginner to bead weaving and loom work, just stick with it past the first few rows. I promise you it is worth it. So that is the finished design. I have just woven in the ends at the end there. I took my tail and wove that back in. And now I'm going to take this off the loom. So all you do is you unloosen your wing nuts. And you don't have to worry about any of your beads falling off at this point. They're all locked in with your warp threads. They're all locked in with the weft thread that you've woven through there. They are all secure. So your weft thread at the very end, your tail and your ending working piece are woven back into your bead design, and you just follow along your weft threads. And if you're going back the other way, you follow the warp threads. So it's like a zigzag pattern all the way through your beadwork. My camera cut out, so I did not, unfortunately, get to show you that part. So now that your beadwork is free from the loom, you still have a bit of work to do. You can either weave these ends back in to your piece by cutting them and then taking each piece, putting it on your needle and weaving it into your piece. Now, I am not going to do that with this piece. Instead, I am going to be tying a square knot into every single one of these pairs of threads. So I have 14 threads, so I have 7 knots on each side to tie. and a square knot or an overhand knot is very simple. You're just going to take your thread and you're going to loop it around itself, pull tight 2 times, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to cut the ends off on the other side, but these sides are already free because I cut them off the loom. They are long enough to weave back in. I'm just going to cover the ends, so I don't need to do that because I have some slider bar findings I'm going to be putting on. I don't have those ordered, so I'm not going to show you that part. But you can put any findings on the end of this that you would like. This is the step that you're going to take to secure your beadwork. So zoom in here and show you this overhand knot. And you're gonna double knot it. This thread is really slick. So these knots, even if you double knot it, triple knot it, or use a sailor's knot, it's gonna come loose unless you use some kind of adhesive or you melt it. I'm going to be using some nail polish on this. So there's one square knot done, and I'm going to do that for all of the other ones. I'm using my needle to pick up the thread off of the table. Again, I like to use tools to help with all of the things. I like to use them to pliers to help me with my needles. I like to use the needle to help me with my threads. I'm a big fan of using tools to support you. And you can see right there that that knot is quite loose. So I'm going to tighten that down. Do another one. And you're going to do this to both sides. Add your adhesive, let it dry, and then cut it. And that's it. That's all it is to making a loom bracelet or pendant or necklace. Whatever you choose. You can do a wall hanging in this manner as well. They have huge looms that you can do big magnificent pieces with. And I hope you enjoyed this video and that the information was helpful to you. I will be making more loom videos in the future to show how to weave back in the ends. I'm so sorry that that part got lost. If you would like to see more videos, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.